What if an entire city could lose almost everything in just a few hours? Welcome to Robert's History. My name is Robert, and today I want to take you back to New Orleans in the year 1788, when a single fire changed the lives of thousands of people forever. If you enjoy learning about real history like this, please consider subscribing and sharing this video so more people can discover these stories. Some of the images in this video are symbolic reconstructions and may not match every detail perfectly, so thank you for your understanding. Now sit back, relax, and I hope this story gives you a thoughtful and reflective journey into the past. In the late 18th century, life in New Orleans unfolded under a constant shadow of danger. The city stood along the Mississippi River in a region where harsh weather, fragile buildings, and human mistakes could quickly turn ordinary days into disaster. What many people remember today as a vibrant cultural center was, in those early years, a settlement where survival often depended on resilience and luck. For the people who lived there, stability was never guaranteed. Most homes and public buildings were constructed largely from wood, with narrow streets and closely packed structures that allowed fire to spread with terrifying speed. A single spark could travel from roof to roof before anyone had time to react. In a place like this, families knew that the comfort of their homes could disappear in a matter of hours. To understand New Orleans in the late 1700s is to understand a community that lived with uncertainty every day. People built lives, businesses, and families, yet all of it stood vulnerable to forces that could reduce an entire neighborhood to ashes before nightfall. On the 21st of March, 1788, New Orleans experienced one of the most devastating disasters in its early history. The tragedy unfolded on Good Friday, a day that many residents expected to spend in quiet reflection and religious observance. Instead, that peaceful morning slowly turned into one of the darkest days the city had ever known. The fire began inside the home of Vicente José Núñez, the paymaster for the Spanish army stationed in the colony. His house stood near the intersection of Chartres Street and Toulouse Street in the heart of the city. Like many devout Catholics of the time, Núñez had arranged a private altar inside his home. On that day, he lit around 50 tall candles as part of a religious observance. At some point during the evening meal, the candles were left unattended. The flames eventually caught nearby drapes, and from there the fire reached the wooden interior of the house. Once it touched the dry wooden roof shingles, the blaze began to grow rapidly. Several circumstances made the situation far worse. Because it was Good Friday, religious tradition forbade the ringing of church bells. In many European and colonial towns, church bells were often used to warn the public about fires or other emergencies. On this day, however, the bells remained silent. As a result, many residents did not realize what was happening until the fire was already spreading through nearby buildings. Weather conditions also played a critical role. A strong southeasterly wind pushed the flames through the tightly packed streets of the city. At the time, most structures in New Orleans were built from wood and stood very close to one another. Once the fire reached the rooftops, it was able to leap quickly from building to building. The city was also poorly equipped to fight a fire of this scale. Organized firefighting equipment was limited, and residents had little more than buckets and basic tools to try to control the flames. Under these conditions, the blaze quickly moved beyond anyone's ability to stop it. In less than 5 hours, the fire consumed 856 buildings. Nearly 80% of New Orleans was destroyed. Homes, businesses, and public institutions that had taken decades to build were reduced to ruins in a single afternoon. For the people living there, the disaster marked the beginning of a long and painful struggle to survive in the aftermath of the flames. When the flames finally began to die down, New Orleans no longer resembled the city people had known just hours earlier. Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miró later described the scene as an arid and fearful desert. Where streets, homes, and busy shops had stood that morning, there were now only smoking ruins and piles of ash. For the people of the city, the change was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of residents lost their homes in the span of a single afternoon. Families who had been living ordinary lives only hours before suddenly found themselves standing in the streets with nothing left. the sound of crackling wood was replaced by the sound of grief as people searched through the remains of their neighborhoods. Eyewitness descriptions reveal scenes of deep human suffering. Along the river levee, mothers were seen holding their young children close, many of them with nothing but the clothes they had been wearing when the fire began. Their homes, food supplies, and belongings had disappeared in the flames. Fathers and older family members desperately tried to save whatever possessions they could carry away before the fire consumed everything. The destruction also struck at the heart of the city's institutions. Many of the most important buildings in New Orleans were destroyed in the fire. The parish church was lost, along with the municipal government building that served as the center of civic life. The army barracks that housed soldiers in the colony burned as well, as did the armory that stored weapons and equipment. Even the public jail was reduced to ruins. Within only a few hours, a large portion of the city had vanished. What had taken decades to build was erased in a single day. For the people of New Orleans, the fire did not simply destroy buildings. It shattered the stability of an entire community and forced thousands of residents to face an uncertain future among the ashes of their former lives. In the days that followed the fire, the people of New Orleans faced a reality that was almost as frightening as the flames themselves. The disaster had not only destroyed homes and public buildings, it had also wiped out much of the city's food supply. What remained of the community now had to struggle with hunger, uncertainty, and the basic question of how to survive the coming days. One of the most serious problems was the loss of the city's bakeries. Historical records show that every bakery in New Orleans was destroyed in the fire. Bread had been one of the most important daily foods for the population, and with the bakeries gone, a vital source of nourishment suddenly disappeared. For many residents, the question was no longer simply where they would live, but how they would feed their families. Imagine the confusion and fear people must have felt during those first days. Thousands of residents were now homeless. Many had lost their belongings, their workplaces, and their stored food in a single afternoon. Families gathered wherever they could find open space, trying to understand what had happened while wondering how they would begin again. Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miro quickly recognized the severity of the crisis. In response, he ordered the Spanish military to provide camping tents for those who had no shelter. These tents were set up to house families who could not find space with the few households that had survived the fire. Food relief also became a priority. A shipment of biscuits that had originally been intended for the settlement at Natchez was redirected and distributed to the people of New Orleans. Miro also contributed money from his own personal funds to assist the poorest residents. These actions could not undo the destruction, but they helped many families survive the first desperate weeks after the catastrophe. In the difficult months that followed the fire, survival required the people of New Orleans to adapt quickly to a new and much harsher reality. The destruction of homes, markets, and bakeries meant that normal sources of food had largely disappeared. For many residents, daily life became a constant search for anything that could be eaten. Archaeological evidence discovered at sites in the historic French Quarter helps us understand how dramatically the diet of the population changed during this period. Excavations have revealed large numbers of turtle shells in the refuse left behind from the years following the disaster. This suggests that turtles became an important and reliable food source for many families trying to survive. Other remains show an increased consumption of wild birds and even white-tailed deer. These animals were not typically a major part of the urban diet before the fire, but the desperate conditions forced people to rely more heavily on whatever wildlife could be found in the surrounding region. Hunting and gathering became necessary for people who had previously depended on markets and regular trade. There is also evidence that many animals were slaughtered at a much younger age than usual. Livestock that might normally have been kept longer for milk, wool, or breeding were instead killed early for food. This change reflects the severe pressure placed on the city's food supply. Taken together, these findings show a community struggling with hunger and nutritional stress. The people of New Orleans were no longer choosing what they preferred to eat. They were eating whatever they could find in order to survive. In the aftermath of the Great Fire, many residents of New Orleans had nowhere permanent to live. With most houses destroyed, large numbers of people were forced to take shelter in temporary tents provided by the authorities. These makeshift camps were often set up near the riverfront, where open space was available and ships could still bring limited supplies into the city. At first, these shelters offered a necessary refuge, but life inside them quickly became difficult and dangerous. Families were crowded together in small spaces with very few resources. Clean water, proper sanitation, and stable food supplies were limited. As people tried to clear the debris of their destroyed homes, piles of waste and burned materials began to accumulate around the temporary camps. Over time, these conditions created an unhealthy environment. Trash gathered in the surrounding areas, and stagnant conditions contributed to the spread of illness. Historical accounts suggest that disease began to circulate among the already weakened population. Many residents were still suffering from hunger and exhaustion, which made them even more vulnerable to sickness. The human cost of the disaster continued long after the flames had disappeared. In the months that followed, it is estimated that around 850 people died as a result of the poverty, illness, and lack of resources that followed the fire. This number represented roughly 1/6 of the city's population at the time. So many deaths occurred that authorities were eventually forced to establish a new cemetery outside the main area of the town. For the people of New Orleans, the tragedy of 1788 did not end with the fire itself. The struggle to survive in its aftermath brought weeks and months of hardship that claimed hundreds of lives. In time, the people of New Orleans began the difficult task of rebuilding their city. The destruction had been overwhelming, but the community understood that if the city were to survive, it had to be rebuilt in a safer and more durable way. Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miro introduced new building regulations designed to prevent a disaster like the fire of 1788 from happening again. Under these new rules, homes and public buildings could no longer be constructed with exposed wooden beams that made fires spread so easily. Instead, buildings were required to use brick or heavy timber covered with protective plaster or cement. These materials were far less vulnerable to flames and marked the beginning of a major architectural change in the city. The authorities also worked to improve the city's ability to fight future fires. New equipment was acquired, including fire engines, leather buckets, and water pumps. These tools helped create a more organized response in case another emergency threatened the community. Private citizens also played an important role in the rebuilding process. Wealthy benefactors such as Andres Almonaster y Rojas helped fund the reconstruction of important institutions. Among the buildings restored were the Charity Hospital, the Street, Louis Cathedral, and the Presbytère. Through these efforts, New Orleans slowly began to rise again from the ashes. As we look back at the fire of 1788, it becomes clear that this tragedy was more than a moment of destruction. It was a turning point in the history of New Orleans and in the lives of the people who lived there. Families lost their homes, their food, and in many cases their loved ones. Yet the community endured and slowly rebuilt a city that still exists today. In this video, the visuals you see were created with the help of artificial intelligence to help us imagine these historical moments more clearly. They are meant to support the real historical information and make the past easier to visualize. I would love to hear your thoughts about this story and the resilience of the people who lived through it. Please share your perspective in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring history together.